So were you successful? Let's solve it together. And for that, let's first of all quit npm start and install the two packages we need with npm install -- save. And then it's Redux and React-Redux. These are the two packages we need. Hit enter to download and add them to your node modules folder. And once this is done, you can restart npm start. Now, of course, we want to use these packages. And for that, I'll first of all create a new folder in my source folder, the store folder. And in there, I'll create my new reducer.js file. I don't really need to split this into multiple reducers here because we only have one feature adding persons. So there aren't even different areas in this app. We will work with multiple reducers again once we work on the course project again. So this is the one reducer we added. Now here, how do we set this up? In the reducer file, I want to create an initial state. This is the state we start with in this app. It's a JavaScript object where we have a persons array, which is empty, just as the initial state in the persons container here. Then we have our reducer function. And I'll use the ES6 function syntax. You can, of course, also use the ES5 syntax. Here I'll name this reducer. And we get two things. We get the state and we get the action which was dispatched. And the state is initially set to initial state. Now inside that reducer function, I'll now add a switch statement where I switch the type property on my action I receive. And remember, type is not optional. You can't rename this. Type is expected by the Redux package. And then I want to do different things for adding and deleting users. Before I add this, I'll export my reducer here. Export this as the default of this file. Now for the actions, I'll create a actions.js file. This is optional. You could also work with hard-coded string identifiers, but to reduce the risk of mistyping, I'll use the exported constants in the actions file. I'll have one for adding a person, and you can name this whatever you want. I'll give it an identifier of add person, and one for removing a person, hence also getting an identifier of remove person. That's all in my actions.js file. I can now import this in my reducer. So there, I'll import everything from this actions file as action types from /actions. And then I want to check the two different cases I'll have. I'll have the case that I have the action type add person. Want to return my updated state here. I'll then have the case that we have action types remove person and also return my updated state here. And in all other cases, I want to return my old state. So that is at the end. Whoops, not inside, but outside of the switch statement, therefore. Now with this setup, the reducer is kind of finished. Well, we're not doing anything with our add person and remove person events here, but this is something I will add soon. Before I add it, let me add or connect my React app to the state. So in the index.js file, I'll import two things. I'll import something from Redux and I'll import something from React-Redux. Do you know what? Well, from Redux, it's create store, and from React-Redux, it's simply the provider component. Now I'll wrap my root app component with my provider component here. And then I need to create my store. So I'll create a new constant store maybe, or whatever you want to name it, and execute create store. And to create store, I need to pass my reducer. So I'll import my reducer here, reducer from /store reducer. This is now what I pass to create store. Now with that passed, our application is generally connected and we got the store which is created by the Redux package. Now, of course, we need to fill our reducer with some life. And we already have the logic in our person's container. I'll get rid of the state there, but I can take the logic from the person added handler and person deleted handler. And I'll put it into my reducer. So here, person added, I create a new person, and now I don't call setState. Instead, here I return a copy of my old state. Here, theoretically, that wouldn't be needed since we only have the person's property, but imagine you have more properties. You don't want to kill these other properties. So I'll copy all the properties and then overwrite the person's property with the state, persons, and now concat the new person to it, just as we did before locally in the container component. And now I can get rid of this set state here in the reducer, of course, doesn't make sense here. Now I just have the new person, which I concat to my persons array, thus creating a new array which replaces the old persons array. Now for remove person, I can also copy the logic from there. Actually, I can just copy the filter logic here, go back into the reducer, and there return a copy of my old state properties, and set persons equal to state persons, and now chain the filter call. Now here I expect to get the ID of the person which should be deleted, and I expect us to get this on my action. So action person ID. I'll have to make sure that we pass this ID along with the action when we dispatch it. That's the finished reducer. With that and the container component, we can simply delete person added handler and person deleted handler. Now here on person added and on clicked, we now want to instead dispatch our actions. So first of all, let's import the actions. So import everything as action types or whatever one you want to name it from the store folder from the actions file there, just like that. And now with that, I can create these two new constants, map state to props to get access to my state, and map dispatch to props to get access to these dispatch, to the dispatch function and being able to dispatch actions. I'll start with mapping state to props. As you learned, this expects to hold a function which will receive state as an input, passed into the function automatically by Redux. And in the function body here, we should return a JavaScript object where we map a slice of our Redux state to something we'll be able to access as a property in our container component. So there I want to have, let's say, a property PRS. You could name it persons, I just don't name it like this to make it really clear that it's not the same as our state. So PRS could be mapped to state, and there the person's property. Now here you have to make sure that you of course spell the property name here exactly as it's spelled in the reducer. So with that we get access to the persons in our container component. Now for map dispatch to props, we also store a function in this constant, a function which receives the dispatch function as an input. And then here we also return an object where we map props to dispatch function executions. And here I map my property for adding persons and deleting persons. So maybe on added person could be an anonymous function where I call dispatch in the end. And now I dispatch action types add person. And I'll add another prop on removed person. Here I also dispatch action types remove person. But here I also need to pass some payload. And generally, important, this has to be a JavaScript object. So you don't just pass the string as an argument, you pass a JavaScript object with the type of that string. That's a common gotcha you get wrong. set the type here in the JavaScript object, and the type then is your action type. Still, for removing a person, just passing the type isn't enough. We also have to pass the ID of the person we want to remove. So I expect to get that ID as an argument in this function, so that I can then pass whatever I expect in the reducer, in this case person ID as a property on the action, so that I pass person ID here by setting that property in the object I dispatch equal to the ID I receive here. And now we just have to use that correctly in our component JSX code. For adding persons, it's simple. I simply execute this props and now on added person. For deleting, I will still use an anonymous function as we did before to then access this props on removed person and still press the person ID as an argument so that it reaches this function here, this ID, and we can dispatch it. With that, we're managing everything through Redux. We connected the dispatch functions with props and our state. Let's now see if it works. Let's save all the files, and we see that we get cannot read persons of null. So on our state, we failed to read this. Well, the reason is, of course, in the container component, to the persons I map here still refer to this state persons. No, that doesn't exist anymore. We deleted this. Instead, we should take this PRS argument on the props, not on the state. So this props PRS is now correct. Now with that, if we save it and we go back, we reload the application, we still get the error. Do you know why? Well, we defined map state to props and map dispatch to props, but what are we not doing? We're not informing our component about these constants. Just adding the constants like this doesn't do anything. We need to connect our component to our state with these two constants, with these functions the constants hold in the end, as arguments. And for that, you learned that we can import something from React-Redux, and conveniently, this something is even named connect. So we import the connect function from React-Redux, and then we add it down there to the export and pass map state to props, so this constant here as the first argument, and then map dispatch to props, so this argument here, this constant here, props, as a second argument. And then you learned that connect with these two arguments returns a function which we then also execute and where we pass the person's component to. And now with that, we got our container connected. But if we go back to the index.js file, you'll see that whilst we wrap our app component with the provider and we do create a store with create store, we never make the final step of passing that store to the provider. Because of course that's coming from two different packages, so we have to make that connection. And we do that by adding the store property on the provider and setting it equal to the store constant, which holds a reference to the store we created with create store. And now with that, if we save all the files, we have a running application again, where we can click add person and remove the persons. And as you see, it removes the correct one. So that's the assignment solved. A little bit of Redux and React-Redux practice.